Mr. President, dear Jaakko, friend, colleague, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I take objection to the suggestion, which I think anybody who knows me understands is impossible, that I would provide the official remarks to anything. We have all been grown up with the one famous quote on Russia. Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Winston Churchill, as we all may remember. I would like to contrast that with a quote by our president, a very recent one, where he said that the masks are now off. We now see the real personage behind the mask, and a little of the riddle of Churchill has actually been, if not solved, then at least put on display. I will use this opportunity to argue a few points which have way more to do with Ivan IV, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great, Catherine II, than they have to do with Putin. So I ask for your permission, Carl, to link directly into your last answer. Because, having read, as a much younger man, Richard Pipes' classic treatise from 1974, I must admit that I am even less optimistic about Russia's future than he is, in terms of the time period that may be needed for a true transition. Finland, of course, has to live with this. Finland has always had to live with this. And we live with a country which is not only an enigma, it's a country of contradictions. And these contradictions are papered over with myths, sometimes, quite frequently, outright lies. Now, we have to live with these lies, but we no longer have to buy all these lies. We can realize that masks are off, and some of the lies have been displayed as being exactly that, lies. Because Russia is not a European country. It has never been a European country, and for all the efforts of Peter the Great, the construction of Petersburg, it has never become a European country. Having said that, I feel a strong need in front of so many senior members of the Finnish foreign policy establishment to try to explain this argument just a little more. Let me start by making a simple empirical observation. Over the last 300 years, a little depending on the definition, there are 5 or 6 constitutional transfers of power in Russia. To quote Mikhail Speransky, I think it was, regicide is our form of government and servitude our way of life. That is to a large extent still true in Russia. Now, the interesting question to me is, why is this? The distance to Moscow is not that great. Why is there such an apparent divide between the values that we subscribe to and that are inherent in the European Union and the values that seem once again to reign in Moscow? Being trained an economist, I like to look at sort of fundamental economic aspects. And what I'd like to do is point to 2 fundamental things about Russia. And when I speak about Russia, I speak about Muscovy Russia, the Moscow Russia, after the Kievan Russian had moved away. There are 2 very important aspects of the Muscovite Russia. First of all, the lack of natural borders. Russia has never had natural borders in any important direction. And secondly, Russia has always been endowed with very cheap, low productive land. That is the amount, the yield on the land of Muscovite Russia, and this is where it's important that I'm not talking about Ukraine, has always been very low. This has made Russia different from Europe, Western Europe, we might say. And it has had a number of profound implications on what Russia is even today. First of all, it has produced a constant sense of insecurity. Russia has always been insecure. To quote Catherine II, Catherine the Great, "I have no way to defend my borders but to expand them." That is still true of Russia. It was true in Stalin's thinking in 1939, and it has always been there in Stalin's thinking in 1944 and 1945, and it has always been there. Now, this way of defending Russia by creating a defense zone so incredibly deep that it will actually stand in the place of natural defensible borders has of course also produced a false sense of greatness or superpower status. It has created a country which is so vast, Carl, like you said, 11 time zones, that it must be a superpower. Yet, the size of the Russian economy is no bigger than the Italian economy. That is one of the most fundamental contradictions about Russia, because the insecurity has always pushed it to push its borders further and further away from Moscow. Turning to the governance side of this, the lack of an opportunity to develop an independent countervailing force to the central monarchy, the lack of an economic basis on which to build an independent landed aristocracy that would stand up to the central power to create the certain balance, or at least a countervailing power, which is so crucial in the history of all Western countries, most obviously in Sweden and England. That opportunity never arose in Russia. What there was of original land ownership, land rights, property rights, and associated aristocracy was wiped out by the Mongol invasion in the 13th, 14th, and into the 15th century. And it was never re-established. Instead, Peter the Great, well, starting during Ivan IV's reign, but Peter the Great reinstituted a service aristocracy with no significant rights of independence in relation to the Tsar, after which every single Tsar recreated his own aristocracy in servitude to himself. And as a consequence, the very countervailing power, the balance of power on which the Swedish, English, and most European democracies today rest, never existed in Russia. And this brings me to my fourth conclusion. This is the very reason why autocracy, incomparably more complete autocracy than we have ever seen in Western Europe, is the rule of the day, the reality of the Russian country and state. It was reality in the late 17th century during Peter the Great. It is still reality today. Now, this takes us to a further lie with which we have learned to live and think, and that is that Russia is a military superpower. Let me be even more dramatic. I see several commanders of our armed forces, and I see other high-ranking militaries here, and therefore I know that I'm sort of walking into a trap when I'm saying that is not a correct reading of history. That is not to say that Russia would not be a nuclear superpower, which makes it so incredibly, immeasurably dangerous. But it is not and never has been a true military superpower. That is part of the Russian myth, which has become doctrine. Borodino was never a victory. It was actually a defeat. The war against Napoleon was never won by Russian brilliance. It was won by General Winter. Stalingrad was never a great Russian victory. It was one again by General Winter, combined with an outrageous stupidity on the part of the German dictator who refused his marshals to withdraw Paulus's Sixth Army. The only reason why the great patriotic war became great was that no other general than Field Marshal than Chulkov had the right to as mindlessly and immorally use manpower as he did. Out of the 30 million Russians killed in the Second World War, probably about half were killed by Russian military tactics. This is why Finland's and Swedish NATO membership is such an important thing. I will not go into that at any length, except to say one point which I think needs to be said and which I've said before. We will become members of NATO, I'm sure, and I think it's very, very important. But I also think it's actually a bit more important for NATO to have particularly Finland as a member than it is for Finland to be a member of NATO. For the very simple reason, as I've stated before, I don't think there is any Russian general as incompetent or drunk enough to argue for a military attack on Finland given the present state of our defenses. However, there is no workable NATO defense plan for the Baltic countries unless Finland provides geographic, logistical, and military support. And for that reason, we will be well received in NATO, and which is something I'm very, very happy about. Finally, I've been asked to say something about business, about the economy, and the situation that has emanated in the world. So let me try to do that. My first observation is very simple. By most standard definitions of war, we are, and I know I'm again probably walking into something that I shouldn't be walking into, we are at war. Severe economic sanctions by various international treaties are considered an act of war. And in that sense, you might say the European Union is at war. Now, I will not split hairs here. My point is somewhat different. I think it's very important for us in the European Union, in Sweden and Finland, bilaterally, to argue and think very seriously how one should conduct a war of sanctions. There are many amongst us, we saw that in this morning's newspapers very recently, who would argue that waging a war is an ethical issue. There are people who argue that all-out sanctions, a complete closure of all activities with Russia, is the only ethical way to support the Ukrainian people. Now, I'm the first to step up and say we need to support the Ukraine. However, these ethical arguments, to my mind, are militarily nonsensical, and they are even dangerous. Now, why am I saying that? Because, and now I have to quote one of the greatest commanders of armor in human history, the American General George Patton, and I ask for your forbearance because you cannot quote Patton without quoting his profanities, so there will be some profanities here. Now, what George Patton said about war, I think is very instructive, even in this connection. What he said was, you don't win a war by dying for your country. You win a war by making the other son of a bitch die for his country. And the same thing is so true about economic sanctions. You do not win a war of sanctions by issuing or creating sanctions that hurt you more than they hurt the other guy. I refrain from calling Putin a son of a bitch. Now, that is very, very important when today we look at the proposed sanctions. Because when I look at the decision which is presently on the table in Brussels about the structure of the old sanctions, I think that there are people who have begun to see the light. Because I think it makes perfect sense to allow trade in pipelined oil and to issue a sanction against shipped oil. Because there's an open international market for shipped oil, which you can access and thereby prevent excessive economic damage. And now, of course, you all see where I'm leading. It is nonsensical to issue ethical arguments in favor to extend sanction into natural gas which actually would hurt Western Europe significantly more than it would hurt Russia. So therefore, we should not give in to arguments in war from people who are not trained in waging a war. Therefore, we have to remain sensible. We have to understand not only that we will wage this war in a sensible way, we will also have to understand that there will come a day of peace. That day of peace will not be the final solution to everything because, once more, as Richard Pipes noted, it will be at least 3 generations before Russia may become European. We have to be able to live during those 3 generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wahlroos. And sorry for calling your remarks official. They were certainly thought-provoking, and therefore I think we might take a question or two, if you allow.
My name is Timo Harakka. Thank you for both of you, Mr. Bildt and Dr. Wahlroos, for your insights. Mr. Bildt mentioned China, so I have a very simple question. Do you see, after decades of globalization, that we are headed towards a bipolar world? And what should we do about this setup of West and the rest, or should we do anything?
It is, of course, as the Americans would say, a $64,000 question. First, I would like to just for the record make the point that, of course, this is not a world of our creation. For those who argue against a bipolar world, those who argue in favor of what they call a multipolar world, for them, of course, they need to understand that this is a situation where the apparent bipolarity has been created by someone outside, in a sense, the argument, that is Russia. The flagrant act of aggression, of course, calls for, requires a response. And as allies sign up to a joint response to the values which we hold dear and we hold dear in common, then of course an illusion or an image of bipolarity strengthens. Now, if we go beyond this obvious observation, and we go to Carl Bildt's brief comments on China, we of course realize that even today it's not a bipolar world, because the Pacific theater is, although integrated into global politics, a somewhat different issue, because it's primarily an issue between America and China, whereas we are, again, in a sense, we have 2 other poles now acting on the European scene. I think we would all love to see a vibrant multipolar world. But if you have had the privilege to listen to one of the greatest analysts of multipolarity, Dr. Kissinger, and read some of his treatises on the pre-1914 world, you realize that extensive bipolarity is not without its complications. It will necessarily become a world of complex treaties, some of which will be overlapping and which will be misinterpreted, and as we saw in 1914, may sort of result in a catastrophe. So if this is a confused answer, it's because I think, at least I am somewhat confused on this issue. I think everybody is a bit confused on it. I think it's important to note that I see no obvious push on the part of any of the people that are working with these problems in leadership positions in Europe today to try to push for bipolarity as such. Quite the opposite. I think there is a strong force, a strong feeling in Europe that we should not push in that direction. We should try to strive for multipolarity, but the world, sadly, is one where, at least for the moment, this is where we are.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sinikukka Saari. I'm from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. A question to you, Dr. Wahlroos. I was somewhat perplexed by your comments on sanctions, so therefore I would like to ask, do you really see that kind of continuing business as before is really the way forward? Don't you think that cutting dependencies on Russian hydrocarbons would be a worthwhile exercise?
I'm not sure if you sort of really got my point. My point was the classical pattern point. And the classical pattern point is that you should wage war in a sensible and efficient way. War is not about cutting hydrocarbons for environmental purposes. War is about hurting your enemy more than you hurt yourself. No one has ever won a war by shooting himself in the foot. Now, what that means is not that we should stay away from sanctions, quite the opposite. You will not find another friend, bigger friend of sanctions in this hall than I am. It is extremely important that the Western world has been able to come together in extensive and intelligent sanctions. I am, however, older than you, and as a consequence, I remember Jimmy Carter's response in the late 1970s when he introduced a wheat embargo on Russia, which had absolutely no effect on nothing. He was succeeded by Ronald Reagan, who fortunately had more intelligent advisors. One of them was Richard Pipes, by the way. After which the American sanctions turned to high tech, which had immense implications, not just on the immediate relationships, the immediate power balance, but particularly over a longer period where Russia fell further and further back from the front line of technological development. That is an intelligent way of waging a sanctions war compared to sanctioning wheat, of which there was a certain abundance in Russia at the time. The same argument applies today.